Welcome everyone to today's Joint Economic Committee hearing titled Made in America, the Boom in U.S. Manufacturing Investment. Today's hearing will begin with 5-minute opening statements from myself and Vice Chairman Schweikert and each of our 4 witnesses. And then we'll proceed to questions, alternating between parties in the order of member arrival. I was going to remind members to keep their questions to no more than 5 minutes, but I think you and I can handle that. Now, on to opening statements. Over the past few years, we have seen a truly remarkable comeback story for American manufacturing, impacting communities both in my home state of New Mexico, but across the country. The economy has added hundreds of thousands of new jobs in manufacturing and construction as private investment has flowed into the clean energy sector, semiconductor production, and advanced technology manufacturing throughout the U.S. This was not an accident. We fought hard to bring real solutions to the table and move forward with the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the CHIPS and Science Act. These policies have driven the comeback story that we are seeing. And this graph shows how factory investment surged after the passage of those laws, a trend that we hadn't seen under any prior administration's policies. With these historic bills, we've spurred a manufacturing renaissance across America. And not only is this benefiting our economy, but it will also bolster our national security and protect our children and grandchildren from the impacts of climate change for years to come. The build-out of these key industries will pay dividends by creating middle-class jobs that people can build a family around in their home communities. They will create thousands of careers in New Mexico and across the U.S. in the skilled trades and in advanced manufacturing. And it is critical in this moment that we work with unions, with industry, with training centers and local leaders to make sure that implementation of these policies is done right. To ensure our workforce can capitalize on these opportunities, we need to focus on training and upskilling. Apprenticeships and vocational training, as well as partnerships with community colleges and universities, will give more Americans the chance to meet rising demand for these careers that will help move our communities, our country, and our economy forward. That's why our legislation made sure to invest in these efforts and in companies that commit to building up America's workforce. Array Technologies is a perfect example of a company that is leading the way by expanding its manufacturing facilities here in the U.S. I was happy to be at Array's groundbreaking ceremony in April of this year with Secretary of Energy Granholm, and I'm glad that their CEO could join us here today. For decades now, Array has been a world leader in manufacturing solar trackers, the hardware that rotates solar panels towards the sun throughout the day. This year, Array is investing more than $50 million to construct a new 216,000 square foot campus in Albuquerque, New Mexico, that will support 300 new jobs in the near term. And they're expanding largely because of the production tax credits that we worked so hard to include in the Inflation Reduction Act. Just as they did for Array, these incentives sent a powerful signal to companies that we are ready to build big things in this country once again. In the last few years, we've seen hundreds of manufacturing announcements representing billions of dollars in private investment. And along with the Inflation Reduction Act, we're seeing booming private investment in semiconductor manufacturing from the CHIPS and Science Act. This law is already boosting employment and wages in New Mexico, with Intel announcing a $3.5 billion investment in its Rio Rancho campus and fab. This facility is expected to create at least 700 permanent manufacturing jobs, but thousands of construction jobs in the meantime. And we're not stopping there. Just yesterday, the Department of Commerce announced new CHIPS Act funding for Solero, a homegrown New Mexico company that can now expand production and hire 100 new manufacturing workers. With support from these policies, companies are opening new factories in American communities to build everything from semiconductors to wind turbines and heat pumps to solar panels and energy storage. That's what good policy does. But I want to make sure that it's clear that due to these policies, business isn't only growing in urban centers. We are driving investment in rural America. And I've seen this firsthand back in New Mexico, where Arcosa recently opened a new wind tower manufacturing facility in Belen in Valencia County. Back in April, I got to meet the workers there and see the first wind towers coming off the line at that facility. And this is just one example of how these laws that we've passed here invest in the economy of the future. These bills are also driving investment in rural energy and infrastructure that can reduce operating costs, lay the groundwork for future economic growth. And with this approach, we're making sure that the benefits of this manufacturing boom reach the entire country. I'm looking forward to hearing from our witnesses on how these federal investments have guided business and manufacturing decisions in the U.S. and how we can continue to support this expansion and make its benefits and make sure it benefits as many Americans as possible. With that, now I'll turn to our Vice Chairman, Chairman Schweikert.
Thank you, Chairman Heinrich. And would you believe I see parts of this differently? Being a big fan of something that's often referred to as allocation theory. When it's done through a government grant, will that government always be granting to the latest, best, fastest, most nimble, most cutting edge, most disruptive technology, or do we often fund incumbency? I think the record shows that much of the capital expenditure, which every dime has been borrowed, once again, this cash flow that's going out, every dime is borrowed money. So you actually have to now think of the rate of return, and we're paying interest on that. We also have some charts, and we are happy to put them into the record without objection, that also will demonstrate that manufacturing employment functionally is the same as it was in 2022. Once again, demonstrating that, yes, you may get spikes in trades as a plant is being built, but are we back into the cycle, once again, of a planned economy, industrial policy, where we actually, a fraction of that money could have gone into the research and development of the next generation that disrupts and makes America truly leap ahead the rest of the world. Instead, this policy has set off a cascade of subsidized chip manufacturing. You see China now organizing, what was the last fund, $30 billion. The EU is now setting aside a massive subsidy to have theirs. We've actually now created a race to the bottom. At the very same time, we're doing tax policy saying we need a global minimum, but over here, we've functionally financed something that's dramatically more expensive in a global race to the bottom of subsidy policy. It's math. You can't avoid the reality. The other thing I will also give is the basic belief of if you're going to have industrial policy, the concept of having government handing out grants and the political danger that comes around when I must go knock on the door of the administration or the politicians to get my cash, the distorting effects that has on society, on competitive markets, and the allocation theory comes back into play. If we're going to borrow money from your retirement and my kids' future, are we actually getting the long-run economic growth? Or as so often was quoted around here, are we just seeing the sugar high for a short time without long-term extended growth and sustainable employment? And with that, I yield back.
Now I'd like to introduce our distinguished witnesses today. Mr. Kevin Hostetler is the Chief Executive Officer of Array Technologies, a global company specializing in utility-scale solar trackers and renewable energy, headquartered in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Array has been a leader in the solar industry for over 3 decades and has helped build out the U.S. supply chain for solar components. Prior to joining Array, Mr. Hostetler served as CEO at Rotork, where he led the company's growth acceleration program, and as CEO of FDH Infrastructure Services, an engineering consulting company focused on critical infrastructure like bridges, dams, and transmission towers. Mr. Skanda Amarnath is the Executive Director at Employ America, a research and advocacy organization committed to the macroeconomic policies that can sustain full employment outcomes. Employ America has written at length about the interconnections between manufacturing investment, productivity growth, and employment gains for workers, among other pressing economic policy topics. Now, prior to joining Employ America in April of 2019 as research director, Mr. Amarnath worked as a market economist and strategist, and as an analyst at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Dr. Adam Michel is the Director of Tax Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, where he focuses on analyzing the economic and budgetary effects of taxation in the United States. Prior to joining Cato, Mr. Michel served as the Deputy Director at the Joint Economic Committee under Senator Mike Lee. Mr. Scott Lincecum is the Vice President of General Economics at Cato's Herbert A. Stifel Center for Trade Policy Studies. Mr. Lincecum is also a senior visiting lecturer at Duke University Law School, where he has taught a course on international trade policy and previously taught international trade policy. Mr. Hostetler, let's begin with your testimony, and then we'll just continue in the order of the introductions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, and all members of this committee. It's an honor to be here today. My name is Kevin Hostetler, and I am the CEO of Array Technologies. Our U.S. footprint includes Albuquerque, New Mexico, where we have our manufacturing facility, and our research and development hub in Chandler, Arizona. Array is a leading American manufacturer and global provider of tracker solutions for utility-scale solar energy projects. Our solar trackers are an integral part of solar farms, rotating panels to follow the sun, which increases energy production by up to 25%. Founded in 1989 in Albuquerque as one of the first U.S. solar manufacturers, Array is a true American manufacturing success story. We're proud to be an American company sourcing low-carbon domestic steel, supporting local jobs, and using a traceable U.S. supply chain with trusted partners. I'm grateful to be leading Array during this nation's manufacturing renaissance. In April, Array broke ground on a new manufacturing campus in Albuquerque, where we will make our clamps, center structures, drive system components, and electrical controllers. The IRA and 45X credits are helping us to onshore critical components and realize this $50+ million expansion. To start, our new facility will employ more than 300 local residents in the near term. This growth will enable us to further develop more onshore capacity and make more solar technology here at home. Over the next decade, we anticipate significant growth in industry employment, with solar manufacturing jobs expected to more than triple. In the meantime, we need to create a skilled, renewable energy workforce. That's why we partner with schools like Central New Mexico Community College. In 2022, we donated a 1.3 megawatt solar site that generates power for the campus and serves as a training facility for Array to provide hands-on learning to students. Collaborations like these are building a pipeline of talent, ensuring that students and job seekers have the necessary skills and knowledge to thrive as the industry creates jobs. The IRA and other federal investments have helped grow our domestic production. As an example, the 45X tax credits are allowing us to onshore clamp manufacturing, where we were importing, and this will double our manufacturing capacity in Albuquerque. We've also invested in new capital equipment to support the current and future growth of our facility. Since the passage of the IRA, there has been a notable uptick in announcements for new solar manufacturing facilities across the supply chain, driven by the law's provisions and the anticipated rise in solar demand. This has caused a ripple effect as our business growth has also spurred growth for our partners. Copper State Bolts and Nuts Company has added an additional 30,000 square feet in their Goodyear, Arizona facility to support their solar business. Our partner Preferred Steel in Mount Pleasant, Texas, has invested $25 million in solar in the last 24 months, employing over 200 people. Lock Joint Tube in Temple, Texas, invested $16 million in a dedicated tube line to support solar tracker manufacturing. And finally, our partner Nucor is investing $70 million in capital for a new steel plant in Kentucky to support the growth in solar demand. The IRA has set the stage for long-term growth and stability for our business and the U.S. solar industry. The law is expected to facilitate nearly triple the current solar capacity by 2028, fostering a strong, sustainable future for renewable energy in America. Array's presence in New Mexico not only boosts the local economy, but also positions the region as a hub for renewable energy innovation and manufacturing. We're proud to work with companies like Enchanted Machine Works, Knockout Metalworks, and Precision Sharpening. This growth contributes to a more resilient and diverse economic landscape, benefiting the broader community and promoting long-term prosperity. The IRA has spurred a true manufacturing resurgence, and Array is just one example of how this legislation is paying dividends. With policies that supercharge solar manufacturing and create new jobs, together we are paving the way for a brighter, more sustainable future. Thank you for the time, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Mr. Ammernath.
Chairman Heinrich, Vice Chairman Schweikert, thank you for the invitation to testify today. My name is Skanda Amarnath. I am the Executive Director of Employ America, a nonpartisan macroeconomic policy research organization. Before discussing what the available macroeconomic data tells us about the nature of manufacturing investment and public policy, I'd like to first lay out some reasons why manufacturing and industrial investment may be of unique relevance. Economic development and manufacturing advancement have long been tied together. No major advanced economy has sidestepped the industrialization process on its path to becoming wealthy. If you compare what each country exports, it becomes clear which countries are richer and which countries are poorer. Richer countries tend to produce a broader diversity and higher complexity of traded products. That's because richer societies have accumulated superior know-how for producing highly complex, leading-edge products and can do so across a broader range of goods. The reasons to encourage investment in manufacturing are thus twofold: ensuring that workers and enterprises in the U.S. capture the knowledge spillovers associated with producing technologically advanced goods, and encouraging broader industrial diversification at the national, state, and local levels. A more diversified economy also goes hand in hand with a wider range of opportunities for workers and businesses. But where other sectors have thrived over the past few decades, manufacturing has seen a general decline. Some reasons for the decline were inevitable, but it's worth noting that this trend also grew more visible in high-tech advanced manufacturing sectors. With this in mind, the surge in construction of manufacturing facilities is worth studying. The level of spending that the private sector has engaged in to construct manufacturing facilities has increased from approximately $80 billion in 2019 to roughly $220 billion today. Even after adjusting for specific cost increases, the level of real investment has more than doubled since 2019. While public policy is surely supporting much of this increase, it's worth clarifying that these expenditures are directly deployed by private firms, not by governmental actors. Not all manufacturing subsectors have seen a surge in investment, but the ones most closely adjacent to recently enacted legislation have. The manufacturing supersector, encompassing computer and electronic products, and electrical equipment, appliances, and components, has seen a tenfold increase in real manufacturing structures investment since 2019. This supersector includes not only the primary subject matter of chips, but also photovoltaic cells for solar panels, batteries for motor vehicles, and transformers for the utility sector, all potentially facilitated by CHIPS and IRA. The timing of the surge in investment in manufacturing construction is the most compelling evidence that CHIPS and IRA are having a sizable impact on the willingness of manufacturers to build and improve their facilities. The effects of policy enactment are especially clear-cut across census regions in the Midwest and the Sun Belt, where manufacturing investment surged noticeably following the enactment of legislation. To fully evaluate the success of policy, it will require translating capacity gains, which recent construction spending should represent, into gains in manufacturing output and productivity. But importantly, it is still far too soon to expect relevant manufacturing facilities to reach productive maturity and achieve the anticipated level of output. It will take time to fully build out capacity and more time still to reach productive maturity. The relevant manufacturing investments, given their capital intensity, are also unlikely to show their full labor market impact through factory floor jobs alone. Instead, what we see is how manufacturing investments can drive growth in construction-related or product research and development jobs. While targeted sectors are likely to see further gains in employment only as production scales up, the bigger gains in employment are materializing right now for electricians, engineers, architects, lab testers, and a range of other fields I described in more depth in my written testimony. As we look to the future, it's important to remember that leading-edge manufacturing production, whether tied to semiconductors or the vast array of new energy technologies, often requires available and affordable financing, a proximate supply chain and industrial base, and a skilled workforce. These necessary conditions for investment often depend on the presence of industry in the first place, thereby giving rise to what most might understand as a chicken or the egg dilemma. It often takes a critical mass of policy support to ensure investment decisions can overcome hurdle rates that otherwise deter the sorts of investments that we're seeing right now. We've had decades of declining interest rates and a falling cost of capital, but only in recent years has a flurry of investment in capital-intensive manufacturing sectors emerged. This flurry has even defied the Fed's recent the Fed's recent campaign to tighten financial conditions thus far. But even with this progress, old and new constraints, whether they stem from financial constraints, regulatory burdens, or something entirely different, are likely to bind. In ensuring that enacted legislation yields maximum benefit for the public, my hope is that lawmakers and policymakers stay attentive, open-minded, and pragmatic.
Dr. Michel.
Chairman Heinrich, Vice Chairman Schweikert, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. It's a particular honor to participate in a hearing for a committee I once worked for, and which I have many fond memories. To understand the state of our current economy, it's important to begin with the tax reforms passed in 2017. By cutting the corporate tax rate and allowing full deductions for new investments called full expensing, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act empowered businesses to expand their U.S. operations. These changes were particularly helpful for investment-intensive sectors like manufacturing. The tax cuts led to faster growth and higher wages. Today, those same tax cuts continue to support a strong labor market, additional investment, and a larger economy. Instead of building on these successes of the tax cuts by making the 2017 reforms permanent, Congress has more recently done the opposite. Instead of letting individual Americans, investors, consumers, entrepreneurs determine the quantity, quality, and location of new projects, Congress and the President have repeatedly inserted themselves into the private economic decision-making, allocating scarce resources according to their own design and for Washington's benefit. These types of centrally planned industrial policies have a multi-decade track record of spectacular failures. Such policies inevitably require more than just incentives. For example, generous subsidies support electric vehicles and their infrastructure, but the billions of dollars of support isn't enough. The subsidies come with heavy-handed regulations that all but ban the competitors, and the administration now tells us that tariffs are also necessary to protect the industry from foreign competition. Market manipulation on one margin always leads to a cascade of new state interventions that aren't just windfall profits to corporate industry, but costs to American consumers. Industrial policy also breeds corruption and fraud. Past tax credits have resulted in schemes designed to drain the U.S. Treasury of hundreds of billions of dollars. These fiscal costs, these fiscal resources lost to the programs also represent multi-trillion-dollar opportunity costs, such as foregone opportunities to make more effective tax cuts permanent. For example, Congress chose to spend trillions of dollars on dubious energy subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act instead of pursuing broad-based policies like making expensing for research spending permanent, a policy that would have benefited millions of businesses and their employees all across America. As a result of Congress's failure, business R&D plummeted when expensing expired. I'll end with the most worrying trend. The Biden administration is actively exporting these industrial policies around the world. And they're doing this over the explicit objections of Congress. Working through the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the administration has designed the building blocks for an international tax cartel that targets America's most successful employers with higher taxes in more than 100 new countries. The minimum tax they've designed not only raises tax rates, but explicitly encourages competition with state subsidies. Paired with domestic U.S. corporate subsidies, the OECD minimum tax has prompted new industrial policies in countries around the world, including the European Union, South Korea, Japan, Israel, Germany, Vietnam, Bermuda, Singapore, Ireland, Taiwan, India, and China, just to name a few. These offsetting subsidies create no new productive economic activity. They simply pad the profits of big, politically connected firms. Congress might as well have lit $1 trillion of taxpayer money on fire, at least a bonfire, wouldn't have fueled multiple years of high inflation. Which leads me to my concluding recommendations. Congress should reject the Biden administration-led OECD tax cartel by cutting its funding and withdrawing from the OECD membership. Congress should also reject industrial policies here at home by repealing the more than $3 trillion of tax subsidies, including those in the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. Pursuing neutral, pro-growth tax policies that support American employers that support American employers by keeping taxes low for everyone will provide the biggest benefits to workers, to manufacturers, to service providers, and to families across the country. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Lincecum.
Chairman Heinrich, Vice Chairman Schweikert, members of the committee, thank you for having me here today. Industrial policy is indeed back in Washington, and supporters are already taking credit for an American manufacturing boom. Today, I'll offer 2 notes of caution detailed in my written testimony. First, the recent increase in U.S. manufacturing investment must be put into context. Before the CHIPS Act and IRA were enacted, market factors had pushed companies to reconsider semiconductor supply chains. Private demand for and investment in green energy was soaring, and several major U.S. projects had been announced. It's thus unclear how much manufacturing spending today has been caused by, instead of just coincident with, new U.S. industrial policies. Furthermore, increases in industrial spending are still a relatively small share of total output and investment. That spending might still be important someday, but it's not currently an economic game changer. Indeed, actual U.S. manufacturing performance has been flat since 2022. Private surveys have been pessimistic, and 2024 projections are now softening. Maybe a boom eventually arrives, but it's just as likely we're again seeing what critics of targeted tax credits, subsidies, tariffs, and other industrial policy measures have long cautioned, that they don't generate sustainable long-term growth, but instead just redistribute existing resources to favored companies at a net loss to the U.S. economy. Second, we must also consider the actual return on all these investments. When the government showers preferred industries with trade restrictions and trillions of taxpayer dollars, the policies will inevitably produce something in the real economy. The real question is what exactly all that government support is getting us. Is it generating dozens of innovative and globally competitive American factories and a strong U.S. economy? Or will it produce a few narrow successes and many other failures? Not just unfinished projects, but entire industries dependent on government support, plus unintended and unseen costs elsewhere in the economy. Today, it is too early to say, but there are already warning signs here and abroad, ones we have seen before. Here at home, the cost of building, staffing, and starting production at subsidized facilities has skyrocketed, thanks in large part to supply-side barriers like the National Environmental Policy Act, tariffs, and Buy American restrictions. High costs and other unforeseen issues have now delayed or canceled many semiconductor, EV, and solar projects, even some where construction had already begun. And there are already worrying signs that factories eventually completed here won't produce cutting-edge technologies that compete globally without open-ended government help. Solar panels, for example, still cost more to make here than abroad, even with all the subsidies and tariffs. The industry's solution, even more tariffs. Finally, politics is again distorting industrial policy's implementation. Social policy tapped to CHIPS Act subsidies, IRA dollars funneled to swing states, slow and complicated bureaucracy, election-related investment uncertainty, and, of course, a lobbying boom there on K Street. These and other issues remind us that there's a huge chasm between celebrated investment announcements and actual productive factories. They also show that the risk of today's industrial policies is that they produce small and discrete benefits at a massive cost, including not just a budgetary hit, but by diverting finite taxpayer and private resources away from better targets. There are also concerns abroad because subsidies here have prodded the EU, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, India, China, and others to offer subsidies of their own. Thousands of new industrial policy measures in the last year alone, likely worth trillions of dollars. If history is any guide, this uncoordinated and predictable global subsidies race could generate gluts and trade wars that would undermine the very domestic investments our industrial policies are trying to encourage. In the end, almost everyone would be worse off, especially developing countries that can't afford big subsidies, and, in the case of green goods, the environment. In closing, American industrial policy has long faced challenges that limit its effectiveness and inflict unintended economic and geopolitical damage. It's too soon to conclude that we're following the same path today, but signs do point in that direction. Now, this doesn't mean that Congress should just sit back and watch things unfold, simply hoping our trillion-dollar gamble pays off. As I and Adam and others have written, there's a long list of proven tax, trade, regulatory, immigration, and other reforms that Washington can and should pursue to boost strategic industries and address strategic challenges. But subsidies and protectionism still aren't on that list. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Hostetler, I want to ask you a question. I was really pleased to visit Array in April with Secretary Granholm to break ground on your new manufacturing facility. But one of the things that really struck me was the stories that individual folks who work for Array were telling about their jobs and their impact on their families. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of benefits a working family can access through a career in advanced manufacturing, what that means for the wider community?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. As you were able to witness in our groundbreaking in April, the stories of our employees coming into this industry and those that have been in for some time are enjoying very strong wages, great benefits, and great additional education opportunities through our local resources with our local community colleges. They're able to build a solid foundation for their family and, again, contribute a great deal to the local economy.
You know, one of the challenges we have in New Mexico right now is that there are so many simultaneous construction projects going on between the transmission that's being built, the manufacturing that's being stood up. Workforce is a real challenge. Can you talk about a little bit about the relationship between the Inflation Reduction Act and your efforts to invest in local workforce to build that capacity?
Absolutely. As I said in my prepared remarks, Mr. Chairman, we've been working with the local community college. We've provided them some additional systems to which they could train employees early on in how to build, install, maintain, and control solar systems. We're also employing local engineers, local maintenance, a very wide degree of different employees in customer service, and all of that is geared at, once again, providing a very stable, very strong foundation for their lives and their community.
Mr. Ambernath, talk a little bit, expand on how this focus on energy tech, on semiconductor production, and infrastructure, how do those relate to the overall groundwork for U.S. job growth? And what does that mean for the future of the American middle class?
Sure. So I would start with obviously the gains have come through construction investments so far, and so especially if you look at the labor market data, while we've definitely seen, let's say, manufacturing employment has recovered from the COVID recession, and it's probably been pretty stable overall. The real gains have probably been more visible in other sectors, especially in terms of first, and you said the trades, construction, but also if we look through the repair and maintenance and into particular sectors of, especially engineering services, and engineering and drafting, and lab testing, and there are at least a few key sectors, again, where manufacturing and services actually go hand in hand, where there's a tendency to say what manufacturing and just focus on particularly that subsector, but I would actually encourage people to think a little bit more holistically about how manufacturing and services are pretty complementary in these contexts. And especially when you think about where the good jobs are, right? Those are jobs that are typically attached to where you're higher in the value chain, right, where you actually are at the leading edge. And that's, to my mind, the merits of focusing on semiconductor manufacturing, on particularly newer energy tech. And these are jobs that will be good jobs also on the factory floor, but also elsewhere.
Right.
That's typically also good in terms of commercial opportunity for American businesses as well.
Yeah, many of the people in the skilled trades that I talk to would point out that, when you're building these things, they're inherently temporary jobs, but those are the good jobs that support their middle-class families. They are temporary. When they're standing up an Intel factory and then they move on to building transmission and then they move on to building a research facility at our national labs, we think of those as temporary, but they're really permanent jobs for those individuals. I want to ask you as well, we've seen some of the supply chain that we hemorrhaged for decades, particularly to China, but more broadly to Southeast Asia for things like for solar panels, for modules, for electric motor components, for battery storage. Some of that supply chain is beginning to move back onto U.S. shores. How important is that? And how critical is the structure of a production tax credit to have incentivized that reshoring of critical supply chains?
It definitely seems like this flurry of manufacturing investment that we've seen is pretty concentrated in terms of the timing of it. And so while it's very possible there are layers of policy supports that have been helpful, it definitely was unleashed all at once, I would say, in terms of it being over a very concentrated time period. And that suggests that it does require critical mass to get over these hurdles. And these things are to get to actually, well, I think there are actually a lot of merits to what some of other people have testified as far as having broad-based policies that are supportive of all industries. There's also a certain quantum of investment that is needed in a lot of cases, especially where you get into capital-intensive sectors. And so these are things that have clearly been helpful as far as seeing the surge, especially in 2022 and 2023. Again, this is the first phase of manufacturing investment in terms of structures. You would obviously want to see it show up in equipment and production later on, and these are obviously open questions that need to be sort of tackled in real time. But there's clearly something that's valuable about having onshore supply chains that we've probably learned over the last few years in certain contexts where we've had a knockout of auto production for 2 years. There's definitely certain things that can build in more resilience, and then there are things that are especially valuable in terms of leading edge technologies where, again, I think there's a lot of national security and economic security relevance to just being at the leading edge there. And I'd say at least in the context of, call it batteries and semiconductors, there's been evidence that U.S. has fallen behind.
Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Doctor, first off, a couple things from your testimony, your written testimony. And I'm chasing a couple things. So in my opening statement, I tried to touch on, so we say, allocation costs of, because I remember the rage from our brothers and sisters on the left when we did tax reform being $1.5 trillion, which, as you know, joint tax missed the number by $900 billion of actually on top of receipts that came in. But this is direct subsidies that's over $2 trillion. And the distortion factors of allocation. So my couple questions are, when I look at the distortion of a planned economy, industrial policy, which the left embraced, wages, wage growth, the cost to society of the inflation it helped fuel. Is society functionally poor today? Will I see that a couple $1 trillion of planned economy spending in workers' wages? Will the wages long run be healthier and stronger? Or did we actually create functionally a short-term sugar high in a limited number of politically connected organizations?
Thank you for the question. It's, I think, the second one. The chart that you're holding up there shows the cost of the direct subsidies compared to making policies that were expiring at the same time, mainly business expensing for research and spending in physical investments like manufacturing facilities. Those policies were expiring, and the The $2 trillion cost of the direct subsidies is significantly larger than setting neutral policy that gets out of the way of investment for all businesses rather than targeted businesses that receive specific checks from Washington. And so that's why we should first get the government out of the way of investment before the government starts getting in the business of picking who's investing and where.
This borrowing and spending and its contribution to inflation of ultimately is society poor?
Yes, undoubtedly. When the government is taxing the money out of the economy to then redistribute or borrowing, all of these things make us poor. There's deadweight loss on the tax side. There's inefficiencies on the spending side. Inflation is making people poor. So it's
For those of us in the Phoenix-Scottsdale area, unless you make 26% more today than when this all began, you're poor. Mr. Lincecum. And I don't know why I always screw. Look, you actually have a great chart in here. Because remember, part of this hearing was titled, the manufacturing boom. But if you actually look at the dot plot and say, hey, here's where, the industrial policy, the spending began, and the number of, plans that were happening under existing tax code, and considering if you actually put in the hiccup, as we'll call it, during COVID-19, how can you call this a boom? There might be a tighter concentration, but the fact of the matter is, under a allocation theory of tax policy, we were doing actually quite well, and it was a wider distribution.
Right, thank you. If you look at the headlines around that time, whether it's in 2019, 2020, 2021, you saw there was a lot of interest for various market-related reasons, the pandemic, geopolitics, and the rest. There was interest in changing supply chains, changing sourcing, onshoring certain production of defense-related technologies or other critical industries. And I think it's undeniably true we're going to see some sort of sugar high, some sort of investment because of all of these subsidies. I mean, we're talking trillions of dollars potentially in government and taxpayer money going to favored industries. But the question is not only about whether that's inducing that sugar high, it's what we're actually getting. Because in the pre-IRA, pre-CHIPS era where we were seeing some of those announcements and some of those investments, those weren't coming because somebody was dangling cash at a company, or they weren't coming because there was some sort of tax credit expiring or whatever. They were coming because the investors saw a legitimate long-term investment that they wanted to make. And those are the types of investments we want here in the United States.
All right, Doctor, I want you to confirm something I believe I understand. When we do it through sort of tax regulatory allocation theory or policy, the vast majority of that goes to corporate America actually goes to workers' wages.
When the tax code is treating investment neutrally through something like expensing or a lower corporate tax rate, most of that is shared by workers through higher wages. The additional investment leads to higher productivity, which then leads to higher wages. The opposite is not true. A tax credit does not have that same pass-through to higher wages. It primarily goes to pad the profits of the corporation doing the favored activity.
Which I've always found an amazing irony in where the two parties are and what we say about each other, and yet we can demonstrate mathematically this policy over here is actually what helps workers. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Welch.
I want to thank all the witnesses. It's interesting listening because really there are two economic philosophies at work here. There's the industrial policy that obviously underlies a lot of the acts that have been recently passed, and there's the very strong free market approach with government not being involved at all. I voted for those pieces of legislation and support them and think that government does have a role. But I think that's really the debate as I listen to you. But I want to ask you, Mr. Hostetler, right?
That's correct, yes.
You have to deal with this guy in New Mexico?
I do.
Well, you can say it's tough. It's tough. It's really interesting what you're saying because the legislation, there's some funds available for you to help folks learn how to do solar installations and then move towards providing more clean energy, correct?
Yes.
The CHIPS Act also provided some funds that got invested in Vermont at Global Foundries. And folks there see that as jobs. They don't see it as the government involved or not involved. I mean, the bottom line for them is that it's going to give them a new lease on life on these advanced chips. But tell me how it makes a difference for young people whose jobs prospects in many of our rural communities are really pretty limited until they get an opportunity to do something that has a sustainable future.
Yes, absolutely. First, I mean, I like to think of this as, Array is a great example where you separate the theory from practice and the reality, right? So these specific provisions passed within the IRA has led to definitive practice of onshoring, and that is bringing jobs back to the U.S. that were previously done in Southeast Asia. That, as we discussed, that new factory will generate 50 additional jobs that we are, again, onshoring back from Southeast Asia into the U.S. This, coupled with the fact that some of the provisions that were outlined in the IRA provides prevailing wages and apprenticeship programs for all construction projects, which not only ensures good-paying jobs and an opportunity to learn a new career in what will be a sustainable future for the U.S., that is in the renewable energy. So we feel really strong about those specific provisions and what they're doing in terms of assuring good wages and wages that will be able to be sustained over a long period of time.
Thank you. And, you know, to be fair to the free market argument, as a result of some of these so-called industrial policies and really putting a limitation on imports with tariffs, American consumers are going to pay a little more, right? But what I've seen is that if the whole goal is to just get the lowest price, then capital will go to the cheapest labor, and pretty soon you have hollowed out communities like we had in Vermont when we lost our machine tool industry. In coming from a rural state, I've seen that manufacturing is a critical part in these rural communities that have depended on agriculture but had the benefit of manufacturing. So I guess I'll ask you, Mr. Amherst, do you see some benefit in these policies that are being disputed about their economic efficacy with having as a goal trying to bring some of these manufacturing jobs back to our communities?
So I would say, especially where it deals with, you're trying to rationalize particular policies for a particular industry, right? There's obviously places where it could be in excess, but it's also, we're thinking about what types of capacities are being built up in the process, right? In the case of machine tooling, for example, is a pretty specialized industry, and where there's also a lot of evidence of where competition isn't exactly fair on the global scale, and where there needs to be some thought given to what capacities are we losing in the process. These are people who obviously are working and are earning a paycheck, but they also are developing a certain set of skills, a certain type of know-how that's pretty valuable and very costly to lose.
Thank you. My time is up, and I didn't have a chance to address you, but I want to acknowledge that when you do have industrial policy, you do have tax policy, there's going to be winners and losers. And if you're on the side, as I was, to support the Inflation Reduction Act, it really does demand of those of us who supported those policies that there be a hard-headed, hard-nosed assessment of what's been the cost and what's been the benefit. So your point in that respect, I agree with. I'll yield back, and I guess Mr. Smucker, Lloyd? Yeah, Lloyd, go ahead.
Thank you, Senator Welch. Just follow up to some of the comments that Senator Welch just made, and I think he aptly described, perfectly described the debate that we're having now, and the debate that we'll be having next year as we look at extending certain provisions of our tax code and other changes that could be made. How do we design the best system to achieve what I think are shared goals? We want all Americans to prosper. We want the economy to grow. We want to encourage innovation. We want to promote job growth and opportunity. So I think it's a very valuable discussion to have. And Mr. Hostetler, I understand or I hear the impact on your business, and I think your employees have benefited from that. You have benefited from that. But I worry about the broader impact on all Americans. And I think if you look at what has happened after the IRA was passed, I think it's called the Inflation Resurgence Act. It should be, because we saw inflation grow, and our folks on our side had warned that is exactly what would happen when you expand supply that much. And while it's benefiting some people, I think on a much broader basis, I talk to people in my community who haven't seen the benefits of some of the companies that have benefited, and they're hurting. It's difficult for them sometimes to put food on the table, gas in the car. Prices have gone up 20% at least, some items much, much more, since we've implemented some of these industrial policy items, as Senator Welch was talking about. It's painful for people. And you compare that back, and I'll get maybe Mr. Lincecum, I'll ask you to respond to this, but compare that back to the impact of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Now, that bill wasn't perfect, but it attempted to broaden it attempted to implement good tax policy that provided a broad benefit, that grew the economy, that encouraged innovation. And it's pretty difficult to look at that and say it didn't work. Middle income, real household income had increased about $5,000 per household. The economy was growing at a much faster clip than it had been before, which, by the way, helps to address, I think, what is one of the biggest existential problems, and that is the growing debt and the fiscal trajectory that we're on. More people were employed. Typically disadvantaged populations had the lowest employment rate ever. And one of the numbers I'm most proud of is we had the lowest poverty rate ever in the history of the country after just several years of implementation of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So, Mr. Lincecum, am I looking at this correctly? Do you want to expand on what I said or react to what I said? It seems to me there are two very clear examples of economic policy that was put in place. We have a pretty good record of the impact after a few years in each case. So you want to respond to that?
No, I mean, I think you're directionally correct. I think the reality you have, and I think it's correct, that we all share the same objectives. We want good jobs, a strong labor market, a strong economy. The question is what's going to actually generate that in a sustainable way while minimizing the distortions, not just the economic distortions, but the political distortions as well. The more free market approach not only avoids taxing certain jobs, so we tax solar panels that hurt solar installation jobs. We tax, half of all imports are manufacturing inputs, so those are inputs used by American manufacturers, support American jobs. You not only are taking from consumers and raising the costs and shrinking their budgets, but you also put Washington in charge of making decisions about what factory gets money, what factory doesn't, what place gets those dollars as well. And that, over the long term, creates enormous problems. And I think it also creates a risk for even more subsidies and protectionism in the future. We had solar panels in 2012 that have then, tariffs in 2012 that have just steamrolled. And now we have another solar panel tariff case now pending. The Intel's CEO is now talking about a CHIPS Act 2.0 just weeks after the first subsidies were implemented. These things have a way of simply sticking around forever, if not being expanded, because the industries that we're supporting are not actually globally competitive.
I have more questions, but thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Tucker. And I apologize to the panel and to everyone in the room because we'd love to dive down into this. We have votes on in the House, so it's the tyranny of the calendar. please understand, I think actually there may be, I think even the chairman may also have some other questions. 3 days, we have to sort of submit some additional questions to you. I know I have a couple allocation ones I want to send to the good doctor. And with that, the hearing is adjourned. And now we go race to votes. Goodbye all.